Hello, today we are here with a panel of seasoned Writing Center tutors, including some former undergraduate tutors who have recently graduated and some faculty tutors. I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
I'm Jared Featherstone, Director of the Writing Center.
I'm Caroline Prendergast. I'm a former tutor, just graduated.
I'm Kevin Jefferson. I'm a WRTC instructor and I've been tutoring here in the Writing Center for 3.5 years.
I'm Rudy Barrett. I've been tutoring here for almost 3 years and I'll be coming back as a graduate assistant. I just graduated.
So I'm going to ask them some questions about tutoring and we're going to have a conversation that you can just kind of listen in on. So to get started, let's talk about why you enjoy tutoring. What's so great about it?
Well, I can start. I enjoy it because it's almost never the same. So every session is different, every student is different. You can't just sort of like rest in a technique or a way of doing things. And there's no way to be fully prepared for a session. So that makes some people nervous, but I think it keeps it from being boring.
Yeah, I agree with that. I like that it's really collaborative work. That, like you were saying, every session is different, every paper is different, every tutee is different, but it's always very collaborative. So you kind of come in outside of like not in an instructor type role. You kind of come in as a peer, and you're just like working to solve a problem, and it's really rewarding for that reason.
And I can add to that as an instructor, and having a lot of experience doing that, seeing that the dynamic with the students from a different perspective. It's nice to get out of what I normally do. And to work in that collaborative role where I get called Kevin instead of Mr. Jefferson or Jefferson or that guy. And so yeah, I much enjoy that as well.
I really love the fact that when I come into work, one of the main roles that I have here is reducing people's stress. While that doesn't always work fully, but that's kind of the main point, is to help people work their way through something and help them become more effective at something that really can have a massive impact on their life, or at least on how they're feeling that day.
That's actually a great segue into the next question. I'm wondering what you see as your role as a tutor. What are your philosophies of tutoring or your goals of tutoring? What do you think, I guess, the point is?
Well, I think of it as very process-based. So I guess my main driving philosophy is I want to have this person that I'm working with develop a method for how they can handle any other writing assignment that crosses their desk. So I want to make sure that I break down, so this is what we're doing here and you can apply this later in this essay or in any other essay that you get. So I guess that's my core belief, is I kind of want to explain everything, make sure they can reproduce what we're doing, and that it's not a codependency, it's training them up to be better at something.
And that speaks to our mission statement too, is to empower writers. So we're not empowering them if we're just giving them the answers or just telling them what to do without any explanation. So that sort of process focus and with an eye toward the next assignment or toward their sort of tending to the writer, not just the particular assignment.
And in practical terms, that can sometimes be difficult because the reason that they come, the reason they're here is because of the document in front of them. And no matter how idealistic they might be about process-based, for the long-term writing, I will become a better writer from this. That work is often that we do to help them see it both immediately, but going forward might take some sleight of hand.
Right, I don't think it's good to just come out and say, well, we're going to talk process. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about this particular paper. Mm-hmm. So I think we do the former through the latter. So we look at the particular paper, but with an eye toward the bigger profile of them as a writer.
Yeah, I think not being tricky or deceptive is important because ultimately my job is to listen to the writer and honor the writer's needs. And while I might have some idea about some larger or more global concerns, I think ultimately I want to let the writer direct the session and let the writer decide what we focus on, but be honest about what we might focus on instead or why we might do something else, but not to do that in a deceptive way.
I think it's sort of this idea of a continuum between facilitation and teaching. When I came in, I think I thought it was more along the teaching side rather than being sort of helping them to figure out what way they should pave and sort of where the road signs are that they need to look at, rather than showing them, okay, well, we're going to do this and then we're going to do this and you need to be paying attention to this, thinking instead about how you can facilitate what they need, what they might not know that they need, but to make it their own process while I just kind of guide it.
Sure. And what Jared said about the immediate, perhaps guiding the more down the road, they do work hand in glove in the sense that if they can be directed toward, or if they can direct the session, they're much more likely to get out kind of the immediate needs as well as internalizing the longer lasting lessons.
I mean, so we're seeing the learning opportunity for something more processed and more global, but doing it in a way that we're still addressing what they came in to see. So they don't, I mean, I think a lot of new tutors feel like it has to be one or the other. Like we're either I'm going to fix these things that you wanted to get worked on, or I'm going to appeal to our grand lofty goals. And it has to be one or the other. But I think a great session does all of those things very naturally. I think we're thinking process, but if we're also thinking like, what did this person want to work on, then we'll be okay.
And it does all of those things, but importantly, it can't do everything. And our sense as readers often, as just outside readers, is that we can see everything that might be done, or many things that might be done, and importantly, not trying to cover everything at once, so that all comments, all suggestions, all conversation becomes equally important and therefore overwhelming. You can only do so much.
Maybe this is leading us to talk about
Yeah, I was going to say
how we
have-
do this.
We have these lofty goals. What are some of your favorite techniques or strategies that you have found to be most effective?
I think this will come up a lot later when we talk about sort of longer papers and more challenging issues, but one of my favorite things to do to start out is to ask the student to give me a tour of their paper, even if it's only a page long, so that they sort of have to tell me what their overview is, what their point was. I think a lot of issues can come out in that process. If it's not cohesive in some way, if it's disjointed in some way, if it doesn't have some sort of a unified vision, it comes out really quickly by just saying, okay, well, can you just tell me kind of what the point was of this? Can you kind of walk me through it real quick?
Especially when they pick up the paper. When you say that, then you know right away there's sort of a lack of familiarity, or just this is hot off the press, or just that they haven't maybe digested the reading material that they were analyzing. Any number of things can come out just in that question, but it's that looking at like that question of give me a tour of your paper, I think gets at the sort of purpose, but also gets at the organization. Like how did you put it together? And those are probably, with the two of those, we probably handle a large percentage of the writing issues that come in. So I think it's a great way to start. I do that too.
It's a diagnostic tool, really, and then helps you prioritize what seem to be the most pressing issues based on what the writer's saying and also based on what you're seeing. I find that so much more useful than starting off reading, because you just get lost sort of in the weeds, and then you might find that, wow, on page 3 you recognize that it's the thesis that's the problem, not the sentence level kinds of concerns, and you wouldn't notice that until you would waste potentially a lot of time.
It's a very, very much a time saver.
Would you guys say that the tour, taking the tour of the paper, kind of leads naturally into reverse outlining, or is that something you think is separate from that?
In some ways, it is a reverse. I mean, it's like a reverse outline light.
It's like the verbal version of it, basically, I think.
So it gets you started on that, so you can right away see things. Sometimes the paper needs a more in-depth one. I think if there's a top technique that if I had to pass on one technique to tutors, it would probably be reverse outlining. Because I think it, and this is, if it hasn't been talked about yet, the reverse outline is kind of what it sounds like. You outline based on the draft rather than before creating a draft. So this is a way of finding out what's actually in the paper. So you you know what you thought you wrote, but then let's look at what's actually there. And so just a simple, I mean, I usually do it if they have a paper copy by just writing a couple of words or phrases by each paragraph, and those phrases usually get to the topic of the paragraph and then also its function. So here's what it's about and here's what it does in the overall paper. So like supports thesis or like presents counter argument or some kind of function word, and I just go all the way through the paragraphs that way. But it could be done verbally, or do you all do it some other way?
I have sort of a sentence level version of it that I do, and students get really frustrated by this, but then they really like it because I never tell them what I'm doing beforehand, but I use it when I have really bulky sentences. So if I get a sentence that's like 5 lines long and the student's just like, I know this is awful and I don't know how to fix it, but something's wrong here, what do I do? So I'll have them underline the most important words in the sentence, and it's usually like 5 keywords or something like that, and I'll write it on a fresh piece of paper, and then I take their paper away from them. And I make them rewrite their sentence on the blank piece of paper, and they get really mad. But it usually at least cuts the sentence in half. But it's sort of the same idea of distilling out, okay, what's the most important part of this sentence? And then just start with that. That's all you get. And then they really like it once it's done. But I usually get a couple of groans.
I think that's a good move to start with, too, putting it on them to like even asking them. I mean, it's going to be a tour question you're asking them to figure out. But sometimes I find students don't. Like they'll look at the paragraph and they're like, well, it's kind of about this, like, so they can't answer, and that's where I just say like what the topic is. But
Well, and that brings up maybe the next step that we probably all do, but once they've verbalized or in writing said what the paper is about, but then to reflect, to say, here's what I think you're saying, to ask not leading questions, but simply, is this what you're getting at? Is this what this paper is about, or what this paragraph is about, or what this sentence is about? And that invites them to either reword it, or to affirm it, or to see opportunities for revision, even at the very beginning of the session.
Yeah, I would say that's my most common strategy, is acting as a reader and reacting as a reader, and just saying, you know, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking this, I'm wondering this, I'm reacting in this way, and just giving them that ignorant reader's perspective, I think, can be so useful. But I always try to contextualize what I'm saying in the fact that I'm one reader, so you might have other reactions, but I'm just going to tell you what I'm thinking or what I'm wondering about, and you can feel free to reject or accept any of that.
And I think some of the things that come out in that too, like if you're reading the topic shifts in a paragraph, often you don't have to even say anything. Like the student says like, oh, that doesn't fit at all. So it's like topic A, C, A. So that it just, there's a clear like veering off topic either within a paragraph, or then later on they'll see that this paragraph doesn't really make sense in this location. So some of those things they'll just see, and we don't have to be the confused reader. But the next move, I think, the confused reader is always, and that gets at that issue of not making the student feel bad. It's like that reader response thing seems like so simple, but it's actually psychologically kind of sophisticated in that you're diffusing that sort of blaming, like your sentence is bad or confusing. It was replaced with I am confused reading it is a subtle move, but I think it does go a long way to make students feel less threatened.
Well, and it also works for different types of tutors. So whether you're an instructor, whether you're a graduate student, whether you're an experienced tutor or a new tutor, you can play that role. And it's a nice leveling move. But it also gives us a way of talking about subjects that we don't necessarily know, or that we perhaps know too well. That we can play a role that's not us, and say, I'm one reader, but you need to pay attention to my needs or my concerns or my confusion.
I think what you brought up about confronting like disciplines we might be unfamiliar with, I think that's hugely important for that aspect, because you can look at something and you can parse it a certain way, but that could be entirely different from what the writer was actually intending. So being able to ask that question, like, so what I get from this, is that what like this maybe this method in biology is, or is that really what this experiment was about, or because I wasn't there. And that way that puts sort of like, oh no, actually if you read it like that, it was something totally different, and that can help them clarify their language and explain a point to you.
That gets to a very common fear of new tutors. Always asks that in a class, like, what do I do if it's a subject I've never seen before? Someone comes up with an engineering paper or like an APA paper, and I've only done MLA or vice versa. So I think that reader perspective works in any scenario. But what do some of you do when you are faced with an unfamiliar discipline?
I think that's an opportunity to really show the writer that they are the expert and to ask them a lot of questions. We've kind of been dancing around that strategy of just asking questions, but I think asking them what is the purpose of this paper, or who's the audience, and trying to figure that out for yourself can be a helpful conversation for them to have as well, because they may have gone into this as such an expert that they don't even really think about what is the purpose of this genre or the audience, and talking through that can be enlightening, and also then help us know how to help them once we have a little bit more background.
I think that's really helpful, particularly with the more technical disciplines, so scientific writing and engineering and those sorts of things, where there are very specific ways that they should be doing things. And they might not even think about them because they do it so often, and it's just, this is how you write a lab report. I've been doing it for years. And I think that boost of confidence that they get from being able to be the expert is really important for establishing rapport and them not seeing you as like the teacher, but as somebody who's a peer.
It's important to remember too that most of these students are just learning these things too. So, they are an engineering major, but okay, for like a year. So it's not like the gap is not as big as maybe it's perceived, and so like your dumb questions could actually be really helpful in clarifying things that they're just learning. So I think it's important to. I have had very few students come in and feel like angry because I didn't study engineering or whatever it is. But some students, I think, do come in with, the tutor didn't know right away, and that is an issue that we face, because we do have a generalist tutoring model. Like we do some specifics in our satellites and rows, and we try to plant tutors that have certain expertise, but we just don't have the size of staff and diversity of staff to be able to do that. So we are putting ourselves in that scenario where you are likely to get papers that are not in the discipline that you've studied.
But that's what makes it so interesting. Like, I love that as a tutor, encountering this thermal engineering paper, or something that's completely outside of my field is what makes, I think, the work so stimulating.
So yeah, I think it's a matter of developing a comfort level with that. And that gets to some things that we talked about in another video about just the idea of like purpose, audience, and occasion. You can pretty much apply that and that to unlock any sort of writing task or discipline. And very likely the student's concerned about the same things, like what is required of this type of paper or lab report. And usually I find in those disciplines there are very explicit instructions given somewhere, whether it's online for like the COB benchmark papers, or whether it's in the prompt. There's a full list or detailed rubric of everything that needs to be in there.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that while the student might know that genre specifically, we know how to talk about genre, and they might not. So we know sort of those questions to ask to kind of fill out what that genre looks like, whereas they might not know how to talk about it in that way. But I think that's a really useful tool for us.
I agree. I think that's huge, because this student might be from a certain discipline, but because of gen eds, they might be taking and writing in all sorts of different disciplines. And if they only have one sort of vocabulary for talking about writing, that's going to be hugely confusing for them. So why is this not allowed in this form of writing when this is? So I find myself always asking students, so in this type of writing, is it conventional to do that? And I think that helps them think, oh, so there are things that are conventional and unconventional in these different genres. And I think genre awareness is a big part of this job too.
I think that's a great point, that we're modeling the kinds of discussions about writing, or the language to use to talk about writing, that is so useful for students to learn. And we, as teachers, do that in the classroom, but I think hearing it from peers is even better, especially because you can kind of translate some of these concepts into more accessible language.
Even something as seemingly simple as the concept of audience. So with something like a business paper, like the idea of who you're writing to is really shapes a lot of like the content and like the specifics that are in the paper. And we were talking about this with personal statements too, like who are the people that you're applying, who are the faculty or the committee that's going to review this document for you to get into this graduate program or this scholarship or whatever it is. So there's consideration of even those basic ones like audience, but then something like paragraph cohesion. Like if someone doesn't have that concept at all, like the idea, paragraph is just when I press return.
Right.
And I think students come in with that. Paragraph is a visual, purely visual construct, like, after 5 or so sentences, I've got to just press return. That's just the end of that. But I think the idea of like cohesion in a paragraph, like how do the ideas fit? Like, does that concept, if someone walks out with that concept and didn't have it before, that's a big thing to know about.
So I think you're kind of moving us toward the next question, which is, how do you know that you've been successful in a session? How do you know that you've achieved that goal that you had, or those sets of goals that you and the writer decided together? What are some of the clues, I guess, that you look for?
I think the biggest clue is when they make a change on their own, something that we've already talked about. One of the biggest realizations I came to pretty early on was that the clue to look for isn't them saying, "Oh my God, you've helped me so much, thank you." Because somebody who's been helped might not say that, and people who say that might just want you to feel good. But when, even if it's something as simple as like a grammatical mistake that I point out, like, "Oh, you're using this word wrong," or you have a bunch of split infinitives, let's talk about what that means. And then they come to one and they say, "Oh, that's that thing we talked about before, I have to do this," without any prompting. That's how I know I've actually done something.
Yeah, it's part of their awareness now. So when we kind of do some surgery on one paragraph collaboratively to make it transitions from idea to idea, and then they get to the next paragraph and they're like, "Oh, that doesn't fit," and they see it without prompting. So that when we fill out our session report forms, we have a section about demonstrated learning for that reason, because it's important that we don't just judge by the smile. People can smile when they're uncomfortable. So it's important to see some kind of demonstration, but it doesn't have to be a revision. It could be just that they use those terms correctly. Like we give them some terminology, and then they start talking about, the cohesion in paragraph 3 is, and they suddenly seem to have it, the concept.
And so that applying also works not just at the sentence level, but at the paper level, where you see them making revisions in order, maybe where they take notes. And then if you're lucky enough to have them come back a second time, where you see, and you know that they haven't come in and worked with anybody else since then, and you see that they've made changes, that they've implemented those changes, and suddenly the conversation is at a different level, or moved further along. And you can see that even if you haven't worked with them consecutively, that in a session report somebody will come in and say, "Oh, I worked with Caroline last time, and here's what we did, here's what we worked on," and they've implemented the lesson in the downtime, in the away time.
I think it could also be more direct. Some students it's harder to read, or they're not really demonstrating it clearly. Maybe they're just intimidated to try something in front of you, or some students don't think well on the spot. Like they're just like, "I'm just gonna write this down, and I'll get to it later." But sometimes it just may be like asking about like, can you run that back to me, or what do you think you'll do next? Like, or let's talk about what the next steps are. How do you think you could work on these transitions? Like, what will you do? And then some of it just may require a little bit of prompting to the less confident student.
And confidence is at itself a basic kind of level of or measure of success, where you see the person becoming more comfortable verbalizing, or more comfortable just coming in, more comfortable making changes, more comfortable holding the pen, more comfortable asking questions at any level.
And I think we do. I mean, not to discount the smiling and the you help me so much, because I think even if it's primarily on a confidence or just a lowered stress level, I think that's not to be discounted. That often they feel that way because they feel more capable, or the huge paper that seemed overwhelming and too much to do was broken down into smaller, doable tasks. We gave them a timeline and a way to go about it and a method, and now they feel like, oh, I can actually do this, and then they do feel better when they leave. So smiles are good.
Yeah, I think we're good at listening to people and figuring out when they're being honest and when they're telling us what we want to hear. And so there are times when a writer says, I feel so much better about this, I'm ready to do this, and they're verbalizing. I do oftentimes think that they're telling me the truth, but that's, I think, through experience and just becoming, better able at reading people. When that's, I think, a lot of what we do is read people and try to interpret what it is that they really are saying. So I think we could talk about some specific scenarios and how you handle those. Let's start with the long papers. So if you get a writer coming in with, 20 plus pages, how do you handle that kind of situation?
I always ask, first of all, because it's easier for the session, I always ask if it's broken into sections, if it's something that long, and if it is, what are the sections about, and sort of what is the purpose of this paper? Just sort of the general things that we were talking about taking a tour just on a larger scale, so we can all get up to speed, especially because when you're looking at those 20 pages, you're not going to be able to get through as much as you'd like to in the time allotted. So just getting up to speed, I think, is really important.
I think it's also important to know their specific timeline for when it's due and things like that. Because if you have a 20-page paper, it probably wasn't assigned the week before. There's probably it's either part of a thesis or maybe it's something that's due at the very end of the semester. But I think it's helpful to know what sort of time they have left to work on it. If it's something that large. So is this something that we can talk about things like organization, or is this something that, well, maybe we should really focus on your intro and your conclusion, or maybe there's a problematic argument in here that we need to look at. But I think that timeline is so much more important when you have something that large, because it is typically a little different than other papers.
That's a great point that we haven't talked about. Anytime a writer comes in, it's important to ask them, when is this due, and how much time do you have to work on it? Because if we make all of these large-scale suggestions and it's due in an hour, which that definitely happens, we really haven't helped them. Although maybe we've given them transferable skills and techniques and whatnot that they can use in the future. But for that particular paper, yes, I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, the appointment form has now a space to fill in due dates. So if they've made an advance appointment, then we will be able to see that. But for walk-ins, if we don't ask that, we may end up finding out the hard way and at the end, and then just realize, oh, well, you don't have time to do this. But I think I also ask with a longer paper, is there a section or aspect of it that's most worrying to you, or is there something that you've really, or have you gotten feedback from your professor or peers on this paper, and then maybe if somebody's already identified some aspect that's problematic and they're really working on, then we can focus there. But sometimes, we do online tutoring, and a lot of times they're graduate papers, and there isn't much. It's just like, I don't know. They're just like, I'm just hoping it's good, or something like that, and then I just start reading. I try to get a sense of the whole picture, do a quick read. Or if the person's there face to face, then the tour will help with that, and then just see what I can find. Just kind of talk about what's coming up as a reader.
Well, so it sounds like as a whole we're thinking more about needing to foreground the plan, theirs and ours, in terms of the hour, much more graphically than we might in a one-page paper. Not to say that those are not complex, but that knowing the plan and even asking them what they need, it becomes all the more important.
Well, we really need to clarify expectations, that they might have
Right.
expectations that we're going to get through the whole thing, for
And what
instance.
we can practically do.
And so talking about that, I think, is essential. I mean, in any session, talking about the expectations and getting it all out there so that they, you know, so many students come in and they think we're going to do X, Y, and Z because they have this idea of the Writing Center, and it's really doesn't align with what we typically do. And so clarifying all of that up front, I think, is really important.
That kind of gets into the grammar question there. So like, you know, if we have the long paper and it's due the next day, then probably what they're looking for, and I find this with a lot of the graduate papers, the like theses and longer research papers, that by the time they get to us, that's what they're after. Or they've already gotten feedback from a committee or like a professor, the content, they already have that, and they're looking for something, either citation or grammar help. So I mean, I think new tutors sometimes have want to be defensive against grammar questions, or want to be like, well, let's go to the higher order questions. But sometimes that's what needs to be worked on, and maybe some of that defensiveness comes from not having a really solid command of grammar rules, or not feeling super confident in your terminology, which I think I would say. I mean, there's a fair number of tutors that come in that don't have like encyclopedic grammar knowledge.
But we hope that they're working on developing toward that.
The idea is to develop that with sessions, and that's something I always ask when I interview tutors at the beginning or end of the year for an evaluation. I ask about like, well, what do you do session to session to build your knowledge base? And then sometimes tutors like they just, as if it's okay to keep confronting the same, like, that comma issue. Like,
I'll
well,
never get it.
right. It's like, well, get it. And the first time it comes up, and I know tutors like you two, like, do this just kind of automatically. Like, you want to know, like, something comes up and you want to be sure of the rule or the, you know, so that the next session, like, you will know what you're talking about. And so I think it's a great opportunity to build up your knowledge base.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say that the other kind of long paper we get is often group authored papers where different writers have written different sections, and they often come in with instructions about our teacher just wants it to make it consistent. And so being able to identify different kinds of concerns in different sections and to be able to express it in ways that they can all understand is important. And so it's not just knowing the grammar rule, but knowing how to point it out in ways that people can act upon it. But thinking about then long papers, and it's, since we can't read all of it, since we can't and shouldn't read every page and correct each sentence with them, is pointing out patterns or pointing out recurring things, and to be able to say, here are the 3 or 4 things that you as a group or you as an individual tend to do. Let's fix it once or twice, and then point it out a couple other places, and then see if you can work on it independently.
And I usually explain that up front, that why we're doing patterns and why we're not just like proofreading, because it's a very different approach. And so I explain that there are other errors potentially that we're not going to have time to talk about, but I'm going to focus on the ones that repeat. Do you all say something like that, or
Yeah.
kind of grammar disclaimer?
Yeah, that's definitely what I do, because a lot of times, especially in longer pieces, I won't, if it's a really small grammar concern, I won't bring it up until I see it 2 or 3 times. And then I'll say, so I've begun to notice there's a pattern of this occurring, so this should be something that you really want to look for. And if they don't understand it, then you can quickly model and explain what that is. But I feel like the session's really going to get bogged down if you instantly see a grammar point and you want to go in and make that edit and explain that edit. So yeah, I think looking for patterns is a good time-saving technique, and it's also good to make sure you cut to the heart of the matter. So like, this could be just a typo, but if it keeps happening, it's not a typo, it's recurring. You really need to address it.
Yeah, I think research has shown that cognitive overload is a real thing. And so if we try to help them fix every little issue, it's going to be overwhelming, and they probably aren't going to learn any of those issues. And so instead, if we pick a couple and really try to hone in on those, they're more likely to actually take away that knowledge and then apply it in later writing.
I think it's also useful to kind of show them some tricks for, say you have a problem that's repeated throughout your whole paper and they have a 20-page paper and they've made the same exact grammatical problem. One of my first sessions was a session where I was getting observed as part of the hiring process. It was a 15-page long paper that was due in an hour. It was during finals week. And it was about Nazi Germany, and he had written about Hitler, but it was without an apostrophe S every time he talked about one of Hitler's policies. And it was at least 5 times a page over those like 15-ish pages. So we talked about how to do control find. And a lot of students actually have never seen that, or like the find and replace, or how to go one by one and see, okay, here are all the times that this pops up, and then judge whether it needs to be changed or not. A lot of students have never seen that before, so the thought of changing something a few dozen times is really daunting, but you can kind of, if you know how to navigate things like Word, it can kind of lessen their anxiety a bit, particularly if it's due in a couple hours.
It comes up for style issues too, like acronyms and like ways of referring to. I mean, that's speaking of the group papers. I mean, the consistency among sections is one way to get around some of like all of those changes. Like every time they mention a company name, one person abbreviates and one person does LLC and one person, so you find workarounds to make that grammar overhaul doable.
Let's talk a little bit more about group papers. Are there other strategies or techniques or challenges that you think are important for new tutors to be aware of?
I think the biggest challenge is the social challenge of working with a group. You get a lot of social loafing where people think, okay, well, this person's going to have the tutor for a little bit and I'm just going to sit back. I'm going to maybe check Facebook for a bit. And that's been the most important hurdle, I think, is getting everybody to be like, okay, we're all going to pay attention now because this will probably pop up in your sections too. We're going to use this one to model, and you're the one who wrote it, but you all need to be paying attention and thinking about how this applies to what you wrote as well. And that's, for me, that's been the most difficult thing, but it's so important to establish that early on, that everybody needs to be involved for all of it, even if they didn't write it.
Because that's where a lot of the discoveries come out. Like if frequently when the group comes together, they've never read each other's sections. So if they're still tuned out and just texting in the corner, then they're not going to get that valuable knowledge. So if like I'm reading your part for the first time, I'm going to see things and like, oh, I should have talked about that.
Right,
or I didn't talk,
have.
or you already covered that. I don't need to, I can cut that out of my section. So they'll find all of these things that they are paying attention. So that is an important thing, because it's, I think part of the group paper issue is the communication hasn't been effective. They've never been taught to work in a group situation to create a collaborative document. So like you're just diagnosing like what's happened when they've tried to do this. They probably haven't gone about it in the most efficient way. But reading all those sections and having them pay attention will bring out a lot of the issues, and they'll be things like style, consistency among sections, the organization of the sections, how do those parallel each other or not.
So do you all like go into a room where you can project the paper up onto a screen and everyone look at it, or do you usually try to make photocopies of the paper, or how do you get everyone involved logistically?
If it is available, I'll try to project it. I know at the Rose Library location, they just added a really large TV screen, sort of like the one in our space, so that's an option now at Rose for Write Night, so that's really helpful for group papers. If not, I guess individual computer screens has been a way that I've seen a lot of people work with things. Not so much with the separate photocopies, because people seem hesitant to make so many copies of something. And but yeah, if it's an option, I'd like to project it. I think that's most beneficial for everyone, because you can all point at things in it. You're all looking at the same page even.
It's easy to see if people are all tuned in to expose the screens.
Although I think it's also helpful to see what they're comfortable with, because I know some students will feel really exposed if it's everybody's looking at one big screen and it's just their work. Sometimes they can seize up a little bit, so sometimes it is helpful to have them all on individual screens. So I just think it's helpful to kind of talk like, okay, are you guys all comfortable with us showing it up, or would you rather everybody has their own copy of it instead?
That brings up some of the group dynamics issues too with groups. That there's often someone who's the scapegoated member who just everyone's just been kind of ragging on, or just like is made to feel inadequate in some way, and then there's like the tyrant, you know, the person who wants to overtake and just do it all, and just like I can't believe I'm with these dumb people, you know, just that person, and so you're gonna see all of those. We have to be like the kind mediator in that situation when like people are really kind of vulnerable, like as you said, with having to like get their work exposed even to the group.
Yeah, I always feel like it's partly my job to validate the person in the group who's been kind of scapegoated, or to somehow show that their contribution is helpful, or to, I don't know, mediate and make sure everyone is being heard. There's a little bit of moving into the counselor kind of feeling, I think, sometimes.
But there's always that, you can always see those dynamics. Like it might not even be one person, it might be just like there's like an alliance, and there's just like a kind of breakaway faction of the group. I mean, there's just all kinds of, and I think it's good to avoid assumptions too, because they've never been taught to work collaboratively usually, so they're just trying to get through this, and so anything you can do to like facilitate communication. I always ask them what their plan is, like moving forward. Like, how are you going to, now that we've identified all these things, how are you going to get together and make sure that this all happens? What's going to be your workflow? Let's write down some dates and even make a schedule sometimes for managing the, kind of like show them how to manage project management.
I'm thinking of managing sessions oftentimes with groups. Something happens that doesn't happen one-on-one, which is that they start working individually during a session. They'll start talking to each other, and because we're so tuned into the dialogue that we have with the 2T, it's often hard, for me at least, to kind of step back and go, oh my goodness, work is happening here, this is productive. Yeah, and if they've got, increasingly they come in with Google Docs, and you can almost see different things happening around the room, around the table. And so going back to the format, certainly having a collaborative thing up on the board can really work, but I'd almost rather have multiple copies so that individuals can make changes or make notes independent of the group. So if it's a hard copy, I'm going to make at least one copy so that there are at least two. Around a table, I need the other side of the room or the other side of the table to have something. But that also enables them to go, okay, mental note, I'm doing this, while you might be working on something entirely differently.
I always ask, like, who's taking notes? Who's going to record all of this? Who's the you know, who's going to have the draft copy open and make track changes notes on it or whatever, so that we're not losing all of this dialogue that happens in there. But sounds like we're getting into session management.
Yeah, we've talked about that a little bit, aspects of session management. How do you make sure that you get through, that you address all of the concerns or most of the concerns that the writer has? What are some of the techniques that you use? We talked about setting an agenda early, right, and communicating those expectations clearly, dialoguing about those. What else?
We haven't talked about time, really, the like use of time.
I think it's important to know when you should ask the student whether they'd like to make another appointment maybe next week or later on in the week or something like that. Because sometimes it's not, you can't tackle everything in one session. Sometimes you really do need to say, okay, well, you know, these are questions you should ask your professor. Maybe these ones, work on this for a bit and then come back next week. Never feeling like you absolutely have to get through everything, because it's not always possible. And I think it's a lot more useful to be able to delegate rather than trying to kind of brush over everything lightly, because then you don't actually get anything done.
that's another process conversation too. Like, so work on these things that we talked about, and then tomorrow or Sunday night you can come to Rose and we'll have tutors there, and maybe we can move forward to the next step. So it could be looking at the long haul. I mean, I always try to, like, even during the session though, I always advocate like checking in with the student at some point to see, just being aware of time. So if you just keep pressing with something and they really wanted to get to X or whatever, and you're now 5 minutes left, and then you're trying to cram it in or like go over or something, I try to at least midway through ask, like, is this helping? Like, how's it going? We've got 20 minutes left. Do you want to keep going here, or do you want to like skip to something else? Is there something you want to make sure we get to? I think that prevents a lot of the dissatisfaction that could happen if we just kind of keep mowing through without really like stepping back for a minute.
Yeah, and I think sometimes new tutors especially are unsure if what they're doing is helping, but they somehow feel weird about asking. But I think it's perfectly natural and helpful to say, is this helping you? You know, as a part of session management and time management, but also just as a part of checking in and getting some feedback. You know, I found that if I can feel comfortable and natural saying that it doesn't feel threatening or, you know, intimidating to get that feedback.
I think it's less likely that the student's going to just volunteer that. You know what? Let's stop here because what you're doing is not helping at all. Like I've one time.
Yeah, I was gonna say, remember
There's
that one
one
time.
Okay, there was one time where a student was very comfortable saying that to me. But usually, I think they're just thinking I'm with the expert tutor, and I'm just gonna keep going, and this isn't exactly what I wanted to do, but or something like that.
We've talked about the importance of kind of setting an agenda and of developing a plan early on, but certainly you can check in on that plan midway through and revise that plan.
Right.
But also thinking about a one-size-fits-all approach and saying steer away from it. Once we launch into one of those, let's say we're going to read through a paper, those papers that are, say, 5 to 6 pages long, and you get into that approach and you're on page 3 or 4, and you want to get done, you want to finish, and yet the clock's running out, and being able to kind of pull back and either do a check-in and say, where are we, or we're not going to make it. Because the tendency is to want to get to the end, because that is a defined end and a defined goal. And you either end up overtime, and I'm guilty of that myself many times, or you're not serving them well with the big picture, because you do get immersed in the line by line reading.
I mean, there's usually plenty to do. You can easily go over in a session. There's plenty to talk about, but I think that question will help bring some. Do either of you ask any kind of check-in, or how do you manage, like?
Yeah, I think my method is fairly similar. I always my check-in is usually, so do you have any other questions or concerns, and how is like what we've already talked about helping, and just kind of, because that is a little all-encompassing. I'm like, yeah, well, another one of my big concerns is, and they'll, because a lot of times I think tutees are too polite to say, like, let's move on to another topic. So whenever that happens for me, I will just do a thing where, because I don't want to underplay the importance of what we've been talking about, I'll do like a little concluding statement. Like, definitely, let's talk about that. But I just want to make sure, you know, for future revisions to keep in mind like your transitions. Is this what we were talking about earlier? So let's move on to, so what do you want to work on next? And I really like that. I'd like to do that at the end too, sort of a rehashing. So we talked about transition, we talked about this, we talked about that. So develop a plan of attack, and those are the things you want to focus on.
Yeah, that like summarizing voice, like stepping out for a minute and saying, doing the recap, I think is a good idea.
Yeah, oftentimes when I do that, students will write down what I'm saying. Like, we talked about this, this, and this, and I think it is helpful for them too to have that kind of recap or reminder of what it is that we actually, you know, in all of the, I can't imagine what might be going on in the mind of someone who's overwhelmed, or, you know, the whirlwind of things, and then to kind of focus at the end.
I think even to put a word on each of those tasks is really important, because again, like what we were talking about with genre, they might not have words for, you know, things like transitions or clarity or concision, and it can really easily blur together into like, okay, well, we just made my paper better. But to have that list, especially if it's a long paper and we know that we can't get through the whole thing, to be like, okay, well, we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, and kind of breaking them into these concrete steps that have names and there's specific tasks is really helpful in allowing them to kind of apply it to other things. I know, you know, my check-in question sort of when we have those tasks, like maybe we work on a transition or two, like, okay, well, you've done a really good job with this last one. Are you confident that you'll be able to do the rest of your transitions on your own? Do you want to model one more, or can we move on? And I think that also kind of helps them, you know, gain that confidence and like, okay, I know what this is. I know how to fix it. I can do it on my own. Awesome, we can move on to something else.
I think sometimes I'll write down a list of topics that we covered on a piece of paper. It makes me feel like a doctor writing a prescription. Here you go, take these. But it does help me too to like see like what we've done, and then like if nothing else, they can see like these are the things that I should go back and look through. And they know what you've talked about, but like sometimes like that cognitive overload thing when they leave, they'll get home like later that night and be like, okay, now what do we like? So having if they write it down or if you write it down, I don't think it matters that much. You know, sometimes it's best for them to be doing it if they're that kind of student. But if they're someone who needs to just talk, and it's distracting for them to like write, you know, this is that learning styles issue, then I'll just write them down. I have no problem like writing a list as we go of things that we're working on.
That reminds me of another strategy that I think is useful is in a brainstorming session to be the note taker for the writer and to let the writer just kind of go through and talk out what it is that they're thinking about and take those notes for the writer. Or even, you know, do the reverse outline, take the notes for the writer in that way too. Sidetrack, but I just thought
No,
that
I think
was worth pointing out.
that brings up an important point of like not having the one size fits all.
Yes.
Like thinking that like if you come in thinking as some literature states like never hold the pen or like they always have to be like put the paper in front of the student, I think you can get too sort of dogmatic about that. And if the student's needs may be such that they you know, for attentional needs or whatever it is, that it may be best for you to write. I think it's fine.
I find myself doing a lot with reverse outlining, particularly when sometimes if it's a really long paper, I'll actually put them on note cards, like a little bullet of like, okay, paragraph number 7, we did this, and I'll put it on a little note card and make one for each, and then have them kind of talk through what they think their argument is while I kind of shuffle the pieces of paper around into what order it seems like they're going through it, because then they can kind of just talk it through without having to be like, okay, well, that should come next and that should come after this. It's sort of forming in front of them without them having to do it.
Yeah, it brings up that learning styles issue. I've seen tutors in the other room there using the whiteboard, and then a student taking a picture of it at the end. It's like now you have everything we cover. We just mapped your whole new scheme for your paper. And so like, encouraging them to like, why don't you take a picture of that, and then you have your map for how to move forward. So that considering learning styles and not being afraid to just try something else. Whether it's cutting up pieces of paper or like, using an app. There are all kinds of cool apps for like organizing and brainstorming and
dictation apps.
Right, telling them to turn their phone on and press record. I mean, there are so many ways to capture what's going on in the session.
Switching gears a little bit, you mentioned that writer who said that you weren't helping. The one writer in your decades of tutoring. Have any of you had experiences where the student was resistant to your suggestions or resistant to coming at all? Maybe they were forced to come by their professor, they were told that they had to come, or they wouldn't, be allowed to meet with their professor, or they were coming for extra credit. How do you handle those situations?
Yeah, I had one last week. I think that's another one where it's important to know sort of what battles to pick. Because some students, it might be a cue that maybe I'm being a little bit too abrasive, or maybe I'm being too overbearing and saying like, you need to be doing this, or you really need to focus on this, or you're not doing this right. Maybe it's just coming across as being too authoritative. But sometimes it's that a student is just, they don't want to listen to your opinion on something. And that happens, and that's okay. So I think it's important to make your opinion known clearly and kindly, but also know when to kind of go, all right, well, let's move on, because that's not going to change, so let's just move on to the next thing and not waste our time, because that doesn't really help anybody.
Yeah, I don't think it ever pays to get into like an adversarial relationship with your client. I mean, even in that case, and it wasn't just one. I mean, there's just one that's particularly hostile. But even in that case, like what I ended up having to do was just, she was just kind of saying, "You're not helping me," and there seemed to be a hostility to all my suggestions. So I was like, "Well, I'm thinking in my mind, I'm trying to help you," but I wasn't saying it. So eventually, what I did was I just said, "Are you okay?" And like she just had all their stresses that had nothing to do with our session. So this was just a stressed out student who was just kind of like lashing out at her tutor. And then once I asked that, she just talked about all these things she's stressed about, and then one of them being this paper. This was like the final thing that made her hostile. And so then we just talked through it, and it went better after that. And we got something. She came back to the Writing Center after that. Not to me, but still to the Writing Center. So she wasn't entirely sort of shut down by it. Like I wasn't going against her and just saying like, well, fine then, go do something else with your time. Like I could have gotten an attitude about it, but or being defensive, and there's no real reason for that. Any number of reasons why the student is acting this way, and it usually has very little to do with you.
It's our job not to make assumptions about why a tutor or a student is acting the way they are. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say that Jared's right, that it often doesn't have anything to do with you. And one of the things I took away from my first year of tutoring was I cannot dwell on this after the fact. I can't obsess over what I did or didn't do. It's just not healthy. It's not good. And without saying water off a duck's back, because I am going to re-examine things, but I can't take it away, because tutoring is stressful enough as it is, in the most hopefully good way possible. Far more common to me, though, in terms of students who we might think are resistant, are students who are just supremely unsure, and that silence or that confusion or the refusal to write something down is often uncertainty or fear, and the tendency would be for me to want to go to kind of lump them into the resistant side, where in fact it's the uncertain, unconfident, aimless. They're not quite sure what they should do, and so being confident in waiting, in asking, as we've been talking about, as opposed to just simply chalking it up as this person's not going to make any changes.
I mean, I think that resistance can often be just a time issue. So like, it's due soon. Yeah, and I'm, you said you wanted to work on grammar, but you also wanted to just make sure that everything was like good. And so I'm letting the student know that, well, you sort of answered the prompt, but I mean, I don't think you answered these aspects of it, or something kind of big in terms of the direction of the paper. I've definitely encountered more than once in that scenario where the student wants to just like, oh, okay. I can tell that they're just like agreeing, but then they have no plans to fix this thing.
When they stop writing things down on their paper, like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, and then they don't write anything.
Yeah, and then they just move on. So I think that's also a spot where you can just say like, do you not want to focus on these kinds of things? Like, I mean, it sounds like you're pretty attached to what's already here, and maybe that's because it's due soon. I just wanted to point these out because these could have a large impact on the overall effectiveness of the paper. But then they still might say, look, I could just move on, and then it's important to, again, not become attached or feel like you've responsibility for their grades or for their personal happiness. You've done what you can in some cases.
And sometimes we have to be the bearer of bad news, like
you did not answer the prompt.
Yeah. And that's can be really discouraging, I think, for a writer to hear. It might not just be a matter of time, but a matter of, I hate writing, and now you're telling me I have to redo this whole thing, and like feeling really resistant to that. So I guess I'm trying to be compassionate in those moments also.
Yeah. I can think of a situation last semester where the student had written a 3-page paper. It was due like the next day, and she was supposed to write it. They were instructed to write it about an editorial piece in the paper, and she picked a news article. So 2 different types of article. It was not the right type of article. So I pointed out, we pulled up the New York Times, and I showed like, here's where the opinion stuff is. You can see like editorial or opinion or viewpoints. So, there's like words that indicate that this is not. And she had tried, and as a result, she had a really difficult time trying to write a reaction to a news piece. And to do a rhetorical analysis on a news piece was like, you can do it, but it's a more sophisticated thing than doing it on an opinion piece. So like, but pointing that out, she was just, I just saw her face like I'd picked the wrong thing. Like, not only restarting the paper, but the idea for the paper, now I have to find a new one. So she got over that, and then we just started. I was like, well, the only thing you can do is this will be so much easier to write if you have the right tip. So I'm going to help you find. So we found an opinion one that was about a topic she was interested in, and then we just started like building the new paper right there. Not always the case. That a lot of they might just be, I'm turning it down, I don't care at this point. And that's, you pointed it out, but yeah, you might be delivering news that is not welcome.
We haven't talked too much about students who come in for extra credit and whether how you make those sessions productive. Do you have any experiences with that?
I think just clear and open communication is the most important part. Just because a lot of times also this ties into just misrepresentation or misunderstanding of what the University Writing Center does. So just like, we're not a fix-it service, we're collaborative, we want to work with you, we're not going to just proofread this while you sit there. I think it's sort of the same thing for someone coming in for extra credit. It's like, I'll just ask, are you invested in actually having a real session here, or is this something that you're just coming in? And a lot of times they'll be like, yeah, I want some feedback. And most of the time I think they go just like a normal session after that.
Yeah, I think it's good to see like whether they're being required. Like sometimes that'll come out later, like they've been resistant or just kind of like distant or like not there. Then you'll find out, oh, you were required. Do you? They come in asking. The first question is like, do you have some kind of stamp or like
signature page.
And that brings in the whole idea of like, me. If I'm going to sign your paper or something, this is not saying that it's like perfect or that there's, so that it's that expectations thing again. Just not assuming that they understand what's going on and not leaving any room for misconceptions. But I think, and I think there's actually studies that have shown that this is a big issue in Writing Center work about the required session versus like the volunteer session. And I think that the studies have shown that more often than not, those required sessions get turned around, like you're saying, and just like, oh, this is valuable. So if you just do your normal talented tutor thing and respond to the writer, then they see the value and they get sold on it. And so I don't think it could be an issue.
But it doesn't have to be.
I've had a couple, I think only really one stands out in my mind, where I had a student who actually said, I'm just here for extra credit, can you just sign my paper? And I was like, well, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. We actually have to work on something. He was like, really, you can't just sign it? And I was like, no, I can't. We have to work on something. And so I think for me that's really important. That I kind of I refused. It was like, it can be anything you want to work on, anything at all, but I really can't sign your paper saying that I worked with you when I didn't. And then it was fine after that. We found something, and it was kind of like, oh, you can help me with this. We can actually work on something great. But I think it's also worth knowing that you can do that. And
maybe peer tutors are more likely to get pressure like that. Just like, no one everyone's looking, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you just sign this thing
Yeah.
and get out of here? We won't talk about it. You never saw me. So I mean, but I think that's a good response. Not just like, how dare you, but let's actually work on something. You have this time.
Okay, so final scenario. We know that sometimes new tutors are nervous about working with English language learners. Do you have any advice about tutoring effectively in that context?
Working with ELL students is probably like my favorite sessions in the writing side. I think they can be really, really productive. As far as like some strategies for going in there, I think you're going to need to expect to be a little more directive in these, especially because this is one of those cases where it's sort of like that paper that's 20 pages long and about to be due, so grammar actually is a concern. I think it's one where a lot of times ELL students come in and they'll say, I really just need help with my grammar. And because mechanics and usage can be really tricky, so it's another case where I talk about convention. It's conventional in an English argumentative paper of this style to do this, and then I kind of explain that. So I feel like it is more directive. I would say that's the one thing to be in tune more than anything else.
And that gets into the cultural knowledge piece too, like the conventions or just like the expectations, and that's huge because you don't want to belittle the student or make them feel like their rhetorical approach is wrong, because this may be a representation of their culture. So like a indirect style of argument or circular argument or an evasiveness may seem like they're just like trying to fill pages, or they're just like getting around the point or something, but they're actually mimicking a rhetorical style that's valued in their country. And so I think like speaking in terms of conventions, it's not right, wrong, it's not me, you, it's just like these are the conventions and expectations of this genre and or this, you know, culture. I think diffuses a lot. I mean, I think that's something that comes up that could, if not addressed, could really hinder progress in the session.
Use of sources is another example. You know, in some cultures, it's completely fine to include other people's words without attributing them, or without even quoting them. And so instead of assuming that they're plagiarizing and doing something wrong, to say, well, it's conventional in academic Western discourse to attribute sources and to use quotations, and here's how to do that, and here's why you might do that, and there are consequences for not doing that, and like having that conversation without making assumptions.
Or judgments.
Yes. More importantly.
I think it is easy sometimes to get frustrated in sessions like that, just because there are so many things like that it might just be, we're just thinking about these things so differently. And there are a lot of challenges, but what I always try to do is remind myself like how difficult it is what this student is doing, like how amazing it is that this student is writing something in a country that they're not from, in a language that they may not have mastered. How amazing is that? Like, how difficult must that be? I took 5 years of Spanish and I can say like 3 things. And here they are writing a paper in another language. And I think it's really important to keep reminding yourself, like, even if it doesn't look like what I would typically consider like a good paper coming out of the Writing Center to look like, look at what they've done. How amazing is that? And that respect is really important, I think.
And not just thinking about the paper, but all of what's necessary to create the paper. So like the cultural knowledge, listening to like a rapidly delivered lecture in a language that is not your first language, the reading, reading academic writing, which can be very dense and difficult and use a lot of jargon. So like I think there are so many challenges that I think we need to be compassionate and aware of what they've gone through to produce this writing, and not make assumptions. And the other thing that comes out about in those sessions is just being open about the communication, as you said in the beginning, and that could maybe be even more imperative that you check in those sessions, because the students, I think, are, you know, particularly from certain countries, like there's just, it's seen as rude or like inappropriate to ask too many questions. And so they feel like they're like diminishing or questioning your authority, or like saying you're not a good teacher by asking questions. So like you have to maybe take that role more and sort of like probe a little bit and see, ask for the demonstration of the learning. It just may not be, you may think, you could easily get through the session and think that everything's okay, but they're just saying like, yes, I get it, okay, and just moving on. But I think it's important not to accept that sort of like surface confirmation.
And as you're being directive, maybe being more willing to be directive, and as you're checking in, and I've said this before, but silence is not a bad thing here. Processing time is important.
Might need more of it.
Might need more of it, and that silence doesn't necessarily mean incomprehension. It's processing, but then saying, and importantly, write that down, or getting them to do more than simply say I got it, but to say put it on the page and then let's work on that.
I think it's important to think about how you're speaking too. I mean,
Yes.
if you do have to be mindful of whether you're using slang or like strange idioms that actually don't make literal sense, like, or maybe using too many pronouns or speaking too quickly, or some tutors just talk fast, and so there's just slowing down. Without sounding like you're talking to a child, but there's like this balancing of. But it's important to think about the fact that your question could be confusing because of, not because they don't know, but because of the words you're using. So it's important to, like, in some cases that won't be an issue at all. Like there'll be the fluency you will barely even notice, but in some cases, I think it could be a barrier.
With all this being said, I also want to say at the same time that these sessions don't really need to be all that different, right? That it's like working with any other writer. And so I think it's important for us not to go into a situation where we are expecting all of this adversity or challenge or difficulty or problems or difference, right? And instead to focus more on, this is just like any other session. And I'm going to do the same things that work. I'm going to modify just like I would with any student based on what seems to be their needs or their responses during the session.
And odds are they're going to be better than a native English speaker at some things. Like they mostly know grammar better than I do. Like they'll be able to point things out and be like, oh, that's this, right? And I'll be like, maybe, I think. So I think it's important to kind of acknowledge those things that they know better. Or if, for example, if they're writing something about their own culture or their own language or something like that, acknowledging that information that they have, that knowledge that they have, that expertise is really important, again, for like building rapport. Because I think a lot of times it can be really intimidating to come in here to talk about your writing, particularly if you're not a native English speaker. And I think that comfort coming first is really important for a lot of students. And a lot of times students, non-native English speakers that we work with, are some of the most wonderful sessions that I've had. Like I've had some that'll come back to me every single week. I had one a couple weeks ago, like leave me a note on my laptop when he left the Writing Center, just thanking me so much for my time. It's not something to be scared of any more than any other session. It's just something that maybe takes a couple of different considerations sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's really important not to see these as like problem sessions. And the same thing goes for, we'll talk about in another video with disability. It's important not to see them that way. And this idea of universal design, of just saying like some of these techniques that we're saying are just for ELLs, like could work, are often the same techniques that would work wonderfully with another student who's a native speaker. So it's important not to like compartmentalize your strategies or your approach to think that you have to like match the strategy to the type, because that makes a dangerous assumption that like all English language learners learn the same way. Within that group, you have like visual learners, and you have like auditory learners, and then you have like different proficiency levels. If we get into assumptions, then we're going to really like shut off possibilities and probably end up kind of like missing opportunities to help students. So I think if we keep that universal design concept in mind, but then there are some of the specifics, like we said, the directiveness. I think it's common that you will be more directive, and then that's fine to be more directive in those cases. And then the grammar knowledge, as you said, I think that can make some tutors nervous when the tutee knows is asking technical grammar questions and you don't know what this is, or the scenario where like article use is a really common one that tutors rarely know how to explain. Like, why do you use a and the, and why do you not use them? And other, so it's we just know it, but through habit. So those, I think, we have to be ready to know where the resources are, and build that knowledge base. So, like, we have books that explain not only how to use those, but how to explain those to English language learners, because they may be coming from another language that doesn't use them at all. So there's no precedent, and we can, like, a word replacement game that they can do. So that's why they can get all the other words mostly, but then those articles are this trick where there isn't a word replacement that we can do, and so we have to come up with something better than, sorry, it's English, yeah, it's just how it is, I'm so sorry. We need to go beyond that, and we need to, like, actually help them and find the resource that explains it. And so we may, if there's any way in which these sessions might differ, that might be one of the ways, is the technical aspects of grammar that are going to be just assumed knowledge by native speakers, and like need to be explicit to someone who's multilingual or non-native speaker.
So we are nearing the end of our time. Does anyone else have any burning lessons or advice to give our tutors in training?
Not knowing is not a bad thing. And just as you see all these people around here, looking at books, but also seeking out fellow tutors for expertise. This is during a session, beyond it, before a session, after a session. We have different interests, different abilities, and different experience levels, and we're a team even during sessions. And so asking for help is not a bad thing.
Yeah, not feeling trapped in your session as the expert who must know everything. Anything you all would say? Things that you wish you would have known earlier?
A lot of it comes with experience, and a lot of it comes with practice, and it's about keeping an open mind and being sensitive. I think one of the key things that we talked about was being adaptive to different students' needs. So it really is just about being sort of compassionate and being in tune with what the person you're working with needs to get out of this session and what you can do to help. And a lot of it will just come with experience and having more sessions and having seen more different genres and different grammar problems, what have you. But it's really, really rewarding, and it's a lot of, it's just a lot about getting in there and actually doing it, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, most of the learning happens on the floor,
Yeah.
in the sessions.
Yeah, I think that certain level of humility that's necessary for this job is really important. Sort of what we've said already about not having to be an expert, not having to know everything all the time. As many times as you can say that, having your first couple of like really humbling experiences where you're like, yeah, I don't know that, let's figure out the answer, is really important, and to not shy away from that, and to be able to use that as a tool to, get closer with your student, or to model information seeking or whatever, but not ever having to feel like you're this like all-knowing person, because to be honest, like they might be older than you, like they know a lot more about a lot of things than you do. So I think that's just important to keep all the time, is that nope, I don't know everything and I shouldn't.
Yeah, I think that adaptability is a good thing to tell people, just like not getting too tied to a script or a single technique, or getting like too tied to like read aloud, or too tied to like a certain procedure for sessions, and just being open, and just, I mean, that comes down to just listening. Like, what does this particular person need at this particular time, and not typecasting or not doing any of those things, and just being comfortable with that uncertainty.
Well, thank you all for your excellent advice, and I think it was a really good conversation. We appreciate your time, and thank you all for listening.